All right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here tonight. I have a couple of announcements, so I get in a couple minutes early right here. Um, this is the first of our two lectures in in October, and next week we're actually gonna be featured on C-SPAN. So I hope you can join in on that. We have John Durrell, Descendants: The Divided Lineage of a Louisiana Creole Family. And he's going to put some stuff in there related to Pope Leo. So I hope you take advantage of that lecture. As always, they're free for members. And we've got two more in November, and I actually just started planning out 2026 lectures, and we're going to focus in the spring. Let a couple more people in. We're going to be focusing on the spring on America 250. So we're going to be talking a lot about uh, at that time Spain's role in the American Revolution through Louisiana. So I hope you take advantage of that. We have our symposium on that in December, and so please take a look at our website. And then the other thing I just want to mention was our Ghosty Gallivant, which is coming up October 17th and 24th. It's at the Cabildo, completely within the Cabildo. There's 7 to 8 different presentations that you'll funny and scary presentations on Louisiana history and ghost and historical ghost of Louisiana's history. So please take advantage of those. We do them every 20 minutes from 5 until 7 p.m. So don't miss out on that. But tonight we're going to be talking about a little Civil War history. I was telling Dr. Goodmestead that, normally we don't have a lot of Civil War history anymore, but Mississippi River history is an interesting topic. And he said this is his first lecture on this book. So with that, I'm very excited to welcome Colorado State University professor Dr. Robert Goodmestead, and we're excited to have you, Robert. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here as well. Um, uh, can y'all see my screen? It's the cover of my book because I'm going to
Yep,
have a
we
lot
can
of
see
notes.
that.
Okay,
Hmm.
great. Well, I thought I would start out by talking a little bit about um, the background to this book and how it came about and sort of the historical method. So really what you do is as a historian, you start out and you try to read all of the existing scholarship. So what have other historians written about the topic? So I read books and articles, and you build a bibliography and you take notes and you go through that. And you're looking for what people have said, but also what is missing and what, as a historian approaching the topic, can you add to it? And so these are some of the books. They're good, but I also thought that they didn't quite do what I wanted to do with the topic. Then I also did a lot of archival research. So I went to libraries and archives, mainly across around the Mississippi River area, not surprisingly, but and also the National Archives. And so you can see I collected material from about 50 collections in a variety of archives. And you have to get really good at reading cursive writing. And I used some sources that historians have not used in studying the Mississippi Squadron. And I'll explain what the Mississippi Squadron is here in a minute or two. And an example of that is on um, the, um, the Pittsburgh log, the USS Pittsburgh, and that's a deck log, and all boats had deck logs, and they mainly kept track of weather, but they kept track of a lot of other things as well, including punishment of sailors. And so I really used the deck logs to understand sailor life on these boats. And then they also describe the battles and who was wounded and how many men, um, how many shots were fired at a particular place. And then I also read a lot of letters and diaries. And so you can also see the example of in 1864 near Grand Gulf, Mississippi, who's writing to a family member. And what I did is I also read through what's called the official records of the War of the Rebellion, or the OR is what historians call them. And they have one for the Navy. So I read through about 4 or 5 volumes that dealt specifically with the Mississippi Squadron. And I created two complementary databases. And these databases tracked incidents in what historians call the irregular war. So instead of fighting between uniformed troops on both sides, and there was plenty of that, there's also fighting between ambush squads, as I call them in the book, and Southern civilians and Southern guerrillas. And Confederate held territory, Confederates tried to choke off the Union attack by attacking supply lines, essentially trying to starve the armies that were moving into Confederate territory. And so this is an example of an incident. It's listed, it's typed out there in the OR. And then what I did is I created this database. You can see a little bit of the Excel spreadsheet. And then my son, who is listening tonight, helped map those and created a map for me. And so you can see that map there, or a similar map to it. And so, as you can see, there are a lot of incidents between these gunboats and irregulars or partisans or guerrillas. And in fact, 368, I think, dramatically undercounts them for the war. I also did something that I thought was crazy at the time, but it ended up being kind of the bedrock of analysis. And it was going through muster rolls and creating a database of sailors. And then the National Archives has put the muster rolls of all of the existing muster rolls from the Civil War for all of the Union fleets, and they're online through the National Archives, and they're free to look at. And so that photograph is, or the screen, it's a screenshot of a muster roll from the USS Carondelet, which was one of the large boats in the Union Navy. And the muster rolls were taken every 3 months, and it's sort of this attendance, but it also had to do with payroll. And muster rolls had a tremendous amount of information: where sailors enlisted, when they enlisted, the term of their enlistment, the previous vessel that they came from, where they were born, the citizen that they're a state of, their height, their occupation, their eye color, their hair color, their skin color, and some other remarks as well, if they were all filled out. So they had, and for some people, not all of the information was filled out, but for most of the sailors, 90% of the information was filled out. So I led a team of researchers at Colorado State University, primarily graduate students, but also some advanced undergraduate students. And as you can see, we collected demographic data on over 14,000 sailors. So we got data from every boat that existed in the squadron. There are 127 boats. We got data for every boat that had surviving muster rolls. And so we recorded the information in spreadsheets and created this massive data set. And then that led, and we'll get into that when I talk about who the sailors were in this squadron. But before we get to the sailors, we have to talk about the squadron in kind of an overview. And as was mentioned earlier on, you might be here because you're interested in the Mississippi River or the history of the Mississippi River. Well, when you think about combat, if you ever do, of the American Civil War, in the Western Theater, which is defined as between the Appalachian Mountains and the area just west of the Mississippi, so parts of Louisiana and Arkansas and Missouri, and you go from Kentucky down to New Orleans, it was river-centric through 1863. And so what I mean by that is rivers were the most important means of travel and commerce in the South prior to the American Civil War. And both sides recognized that the rivers were going to be crucial in either armies advancing or armies being supplied or in defending territory. And so because of that, both sides came up with strategies to try to control the rivers. And for the North, or the United States, they emphasized the construction of gunboats. The Confederacy, which was primarily on the defensive, they emphasized the building of forts or some kind of installation to block the river. And in fact, there were two of those down in New Orleans or next to New Orleans that the Union easily brushed past in 1862. That was a completely different fleet. That was the Blue Water Navy. But the Confederacy also had boats and the Union also had forts. It's just a matter of what they emphasized. And the Mississippi Squadron did not exist in 1861 when South Carolina, or excuse me, in 1860 when South Carolina seceded. And it was the United States built this squadron. Some of the boats were from scratch, and some of them were converted commercial steamboats. And it became the Union's second largest fleet. As you can see, 127 boats and about 18,000 sailors. As I implied, there's no master list of sailors. Navy record keeping is a lot different than Army record keeping. It's not as good. And that might be one reason why there's less research on the Navy than there is in the Army in the Civil War. But this is the first time that the U.S. Built an inland Navy since the War of 1812. And the inland Navy was most famous for the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812. And it's also going to be a Navy that we're going to talk about engaged in this anti-guerrilla riverine warfare, which is the first time in American history that you have boats doing this. And it's the last time since the Vietnam War. And so I put the map up here to give you a sense of, and these are maps that are in the book, to give you a sense for kind of the scale of the war. So it takes place along the Mississippi, obviously, from Cairo, Illinois, which is at the junction of the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, if you're looking at the map that's at least on the left side of my screen. And then, of course, down the Mississippi through into Louisiana. And this squadron went all the way to New Orleans. But then it was also on the other rivers as well, the Ohio River, the White River, the Yazoo. It roamed all over the place throughout the South. Well, let's talk about the boats. Because I said these boats did not exist in 1860 and 1861 as commercial or as military fighting craft. And the squadron was truly a fleet. And a fleet means that it has different kinds of boats that do different things. And I use the word boat specifically because a boat was something that would, in this day and age, in 1860 through 1865, a boat was on a river and a ship was on the ocean. And they had different types of construction. And so boats tended to have a hull which was flat. So the idea was to do more of floating on the water rather than getting very deep into the water. And part of that is because you wanted to be able to travel on lower on rivers that didn't have as much water. Whereas a ship had a keel, and the keel was more of a V shape, and it went deeper into the water because you needed that stability for waves and for storms that you would encounter on the ocean. So boats were different than ships. And the sailors who were used to fighting, or at least used to serving on ships, came to these boats on the Western rivers, and they looked at them. They marveled because they weren't really ships. And these guys, in some ways, weren't really sailors because these boats didn't sail on the Mississippi River. They were powered by steam. All of them were powered by steam. Whereas in the Blue Water Navy, you had boats that were a combination of steam and sail. So sailors really had to know how to sail. They had to tie the knots. They had to put up the sails on the masts, and they had to do all of that, and they had to reckon out on the water. Whereas on the Mississippi Squadron, these men were more like working in a factory as opposed to sailing on a sailboat or a vessel of that type. But these are examples of three of the primary craft that were in the Mississippi Squadron. On the bottom is the USS Carondelet, a City-class ironclad. these were amongst there were 7 of these named after Mississippi River, or excuse me, Mississippi River Valley cities. There was the Pittsburgh that I referred to earlier. There's the Cairo and some other ones. Um, these were amongst the biggest boats in the fleet. They were about 60 yards long and about 2/3 of the width of a football field. They had 13 cannons, uh, 4 on each side, 3 in the front and 2 in the back. And the largest cannon was a 64-pounder. And when you say 64-pounder, that means that it shot that cannonball about 2 miles. And it had a crew of around 200 men. These had awesome power. And they're ironclads, which meant that they had iron siding. You can't see it very well in the picture, but the iron siding was flat, and it was sort of like siding on a modern day house. It was overlapping a little bit. And for the most part, it certainly stopped musket balls, and it stopped many cannonballs, but not all cannonballs. We also had timberclads, and that's that top picture. There were 3 of those in the squadron. And it was thick timber on these boats. The timber was about a foot thick. It was oak, and you can kind of see the planking on it. These are also known as bandboxes. They served pretty well, but they couldn't hold up to Southern cannons. They would get obliterated if they were in a fight with them. The most common boat in the fleet is pictured there on the left, the USS Cricket, and it was a tin clad. And all of the tin clads in the squadron were commercial steamboats prior to the war, and they had boilerplate put on the side of them. And you can see that on the bottom layer of the boat of the Cricket that you can see there. Boilerplate was 1 inch thick, so it could stop a musket ball, but it could not stop a cannonball. And they had relatively light cannons. They had probably 16 pounders for the most part. Sometimes had a light draft, and these were meant to be anti-guerrilla and patrol boats. And that's why they were the most numerous, because the Union needed them to suppress this guerrilla war. The squadron also had a lot of support vessels. It had a boat that was an ammunition boat. It had what were called receiving boats that took the sailors on when they enlisted. It also had the USS Red Rover, which was, as you can see from the screen, the United States Navy's first ever hospital boat. And it was a really interesting boat to study. And I had no idea that this existed before I got into this project. You can see that 4 nuns served on the boat, and at least 4 women served on the boat. They were former slaves, and one of them, her name was Mary Stokes, and she was married to a black slave, a man who had escaped and enlisted in the Union Navy. They were married, and they both served on this boat. And after the war, she applied for a pension, and she applied for the pension as the wife of a sailor. And that was very common, but this pension was denied. So what she did was to apply for a pension as a combatant in the war, because she was listed on the muster rolls and she received pay for her duty in the war. So I've seen the muster roll. You can go to the National Archives website and go to the Red Rover, and you can find her on there. You can also find the nuns, Sister Adelisa, or Sister Adela and Sister Teresa as well. But back to Stokes. So she applied for a pension based on her service as a woman in the Civil War. And she was awarded this pension. And I've seen her pension file that's in the National Archives. So she is the first woman in American history to receive a pension for combat as a woman. Now, she wasn't technically in combat, but she was in a combat theater. So a very interesting story, Mary Stokes. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sailors in the fleet, because the majority of them were men. The few women were the exception. And the conclusions that I'm going to make here are based on that database that my students and I put together. So we found out that enlistment patterns varied over time in the squadron. And we divided the sailors into 4 basic categories. So native-born whites, white men born in the United States, immigrants, and I'll talk about them in a second, formerly enslaved men, who were the smallest group, and then, who were the 3rd largest group, and then free black men, who were the smallest group. And when you look at percentages, at the beginning of the war, there are almost no formerly enslaved men in the squadron and just a few free men. The Navy capped black enlistment prior to the Civil War at 10%, and that's exactly what the Brownwater Navy was at in that first phase, which I made these phases based on the data. So they don't necessarily correspond to like traditional years in the war. So you can see it was April 61 to June of 62. But then you look at the second phase and it changes dramatically. Immigrant enlistments go way down, and enlistments of formerly enslaved men go way up, as do free blacks. And then phase 3, you have more formerly enslaved men enlisting than immigrants. And then in phase 4, it kind of goes back to what it was in phase 1, and then you can see the overall percentages. And those enlistment patterns also varied over time. And there weren't many in 1861, not surprisingly. The biggest year, when you look at average enlistments per month, again, this is from the data set, was 530 men per month, and with the average being about 300 per month. But if you look at that black line on the map, that's what really astounded me when I started to crunch the numbers. And in August and September of 1864, you had this massive enlistment of men in the Navy, in this Brownwater Navy. And so my question was, why? Well, it's because so many men who had enlisted early in the war did not re-enlist. And so you had this massive turnover in 1864, which meant that the fleet was not as combat ready as it was prior to this time. In fact, I estimate that the enlistment rate was probably around the re-enlistment rate was probably around 15%. It was very low. In thinking about immigrants, Ireland by far is the country that provided the most immigrants into the Mississippi Squadron, and you can see the percentages there on the screen. The United Kingdom was next, and then Germany did not exist as Germany as we know it today. So I aggregated together if they said Bavaria or Prussia or Hesse or one of the German states, put those all together, and then Canada, and then Norway, and then France and Sweden, and then all other. Men were literally from all over the globe. There was one man who listed his birthplace as at sea under the English flag. There was a sailor from Zanzibar, just all over the place. It was really interesting to see that as well. That photograph is an interesting sailor. He left behind a diary that's actually online, and I think it's pretty interesting to read. He was an Irish immigrant. His parents brought him to the United States when he was 7, and he had a lot of naval experience, and he was at first in the Union Army and then volunteered to transfer into the Brownwater Army or Brownwater Navy. And he won the Medal of Honor while he was on the Carondelet when he was in a fight with one of the Confederate vessels. And then he later went back into the Army and then ended up in the cavalry. Very interesting guy. The Medal of Honor was initiated during the American Civil War, and it was the only medal that the government gave out. And so the standards for receiving a Medal of Honor were lower than it is today. It wasn't as prestigious as it is today. But when we looked at occupations, again, from the data set, we noticed something that I thought was really interesting. If you were a white man and born in the United States, you were much more likely to be a farmer than if you were an immigrant, whereas it's 25% to 8%, whereas immigrants were much more likely to be have some kind of maritime experience. You can see it was 34% to 19%. And then you can see the other percentages as well. And so what I concluded is that these immigrants were men who kind of were this, as one author called them, this roving international proletariat, who were in search of work and a future, and that took them to the United States, and for many of them, it took them to the Brownwater Navy. As I alluded to before, there was a significant portion of Black men who served in the Mississippi Squadron. As far as it was close to 25%. That was more than the percentage of Black men who served in the Union Army. That was about 10%. And the majority of Black men who served in the Union Navy, the Mississippi Squadron specifically, but the Union Navy in general, were former slaves. They had run away, or in some cases, these men were impressed. A boat would stop at a plantation and they needed sailors, and they would round up men who looked like they might be sailors and put them on the boat and leave. I don't have a good sense of what that statistic was in terms of percentages of those who enlisted or those who were forcibly enlisted. The records just aren't there. But these are, I think, rare photographs of two individuals. The only two known photographs of Black men in the Mississippi Squadron. On the left, you can see is Robert Walker. He was a field hand on a Louisiana plantation, who enlisted as an 11-year-old boy. And the other one is George Washington. His enslaver's name was Blakely, but he dropped that last name and just kept the name George Washington when he enlisted, and he was on multiple boats. For the most part, Black men who served on these boats were put into the worst roles. And so they were, a boy was a rating. So for the Navy, a rating is a rank. The Army calls them ranks, Navy calls them ratings. And in the old Navy, prior to the Civil War, a boy was an apprentice, and a boy was truly a boy. But in the Mississippi Squadron, a boy, for the most part, became a servant of an officer. And so what I take from this photograph and analyzing when it says our Bob, these are officers who probably paid for this photograph of Robert Walker at whatever studio it was at, kept it, and named him our Bob. And these boys did work for the sailors. And so they would cook for them, they would clean their rooms, they would shine their shoes, they would empty their chamber pots. In some ways, they weren't that much different than how they were treated in slavery. They were certainly paid, but they weren't doing work that was much different than a domestic slave prior to the American Civil War. And men could be classified as boys. And so there was actually a 55-year-old man whose rank was a boy. And slaves were firemen, and they were coal heavers, and they were put into difficult jobs. There were a few who were not and who rose in the ranks, but that was the exception to the rule. Many of these former slaves had been forcibly removed from another state. And so you can see on the map, Louisiana, Virginia, and then that long one that has DC, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, etc. By the time of the Civil War, those were states that were involved in the domestic slave trade. And so these men were either bought and sold by a slave trader, or they're forcibly removed by the family moving from Virginia to, say, Mississippi. So again, it's a significant percentage of these former slaves who had experienced this forced migration. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the fleet did. And so I kind of divided what they did into 4 different areas, 4 different missions. And the most obvious one, and the one that most historians have written about, was attacking Confederate strongholds. And I provide a little bit of a list there of the strongholds that these boats attacked. And there's a lithograph of boats attacking. The squadron really had a mixed record, and I would argue not a very good record in attacking these forts. And there's a naval saying that a ship is a fool to fight a fort. And these boats were at a significant disadvantage because they never had a stable gun platform. And so every time they fired their gun, they're in a different position because they're on the water and they're moving around, and the river, you know, that has a significant current in a lot of places. And so they had a difficult time firing their cannons into the same location. And only in one case at Fort Hindman, which is in Arkansas, did they actually destroy the fort. Now they helped reduce Fort Henry, but Fort Henry was flooding. And in other cases, they are either responsible for, with the Army's help, of forcing a surrender or a capture or an evacuation of the fort. But these boats are crucial. So even though they don't destroy a fort, they are crucial for helping to surround the fort. The Army would be on the land, and then eventually the Union took all of these locations. And this cooperation between the Army and the Navy is something that we'll get to here in about 5 minutes. The Confederacy did build a number of boats. They were, for the most part, not as good as the Union boats, with the exception of the CSS Arkansas, which was the most famous Confederate boat on the Western waters. For the most part, though, the Confederate boats, a lot of them were cotton clad. So believe it or not, they used bulkheads and they squeezed cotton in between them. And so cannonballs are supposed to kind of bounce off because of the cotton. It didn't work. These boats just got destroyed. And the CSS Arkansas was able to sink a couple of Union boats. It was a ram, in addition to having cannons. And so the Confederacy revived the strategy of ramming that had been dead since the Greeks and the Romans were fighting on the sea. But the ramming, even though it sank a couple of Union boats, the Union was able to raise those boats, repair them, and put them back into service. And so in some ways, the Arkansas did nothing to change the strategic situation on the Western rivers. The biggest battle that happened on a boat-to-boat conflict happened at Memphis, June 6, 1862, where a Union fleet and then also some Union rams took on what was called the Confederate Defense Fleet and just completely obliterated it. One of the 12 Confederate boats escaped. Otherwise, all the rest were destroyed on that morning of June 6th. And Southern civilians sat outside of Memphis. They sat on the levee and they watched this battle, and they were very disappointed in the result. And so the net result of all of this is, for the most part, the Union could roam the Western waters as it wanted to and not really worry about a Confederate boat harassing them or sinking them. A third war was joint expeditions, or combined operations, we might say today. And the Union forced the Navy, and I used forced very specifically, to go on these smaller rivers for a variety of reasons. The first one was the White River in Arkansas in 1862. That ended badly for the fleet. The next two were involved with the attempted capture of Vicksburg in 1863, and they were just north of Vicksburg in Steele's Bayou and also the Yazoo River. Those ended badly as well and almost led to the destruction of about a quarter of the fleet, because these boats are put on these really small rivers, and it was a big disadvantage because, number one, there wasn't a lot of water in the river, and so they could get stuck pretty easily. And secondly, the rivers were narrower, and the boats did better when they're in the middle of the river, and the Confederates had a longer distance to shoot at them. But if you're right up next to the bank and the Confederates have their cannons, the Confederates are more accurate. And the Yazoo Pass expedition specifically almost ended very badly and needed the Army to bail out the Union Navy. And then the last one was the very famous Red River expedition of 1864, where the Union took, it was about 20 boats into the Red River. That year was one of the lowest years of rainfall, and so the Red River was lower than it had been in recent memory. And again, the Union almost lost its fleet up by Alexandria. With there are falls in the river near there, and the Red River expedition is just this crazy thing to research and write about. It was really a cotton stealing expedition on the part of the Union Navy and the Union Army. They took out just hundreds of bales of cotton and sold them. And sailors, as a little bit of an aside, if this cotton went on, it was called the prize market and was sold, they got a share of the revenue. And so there's one sailor who writes in one of his diaries about getting $100 in prize revenue after the Red River expedition. But the thing that the Mississippi Squadron did the most was to protect Union supply lines and suppress this guerrilla war. And this is a chart. I don't know why it turned green when I put it on my screen. It's a chart that's in the book, but somehow it got mangled when I put it in the PowerPoint. I won't go through the numbers specifically, except to say that in the middle of the war, there's a lot of combat between northern boats and southern either guerrillas or ambush squads. And for the North, you're looking at 8 incidents a month, and then it goes up to 10 incidents a month. For the South, it goes from 6 to 8, and then it stays at 8 in the last part of the war. And the South did have some success. They were able to sink some Union boats, especially in that last phase. When I say boats, I mean from the Mississippi Squadron. They also sank a lot of boats that were involved in trying to supply the Union armies. And it got to the point where the reason it built so many boats is it spreads them out along the rivers, and it creates these patrol districts. And so it's kind of like a policeman on a beat, and they would patrol about 5 to 7, maybe 12 miles of river. And if they were escorting a Union steamboat that had supplies for the Union Army, they would literally pass it off to the next boat. And so these became very tempting targets for Confederate guerrillas. But then what the Union did is it realized that these Confederate guerrillas were being sheltered by Confederate civilians. And so it would land sailors onto the banks of the river and destroy Southern plantations and burn down Southern barns and destroy Southern cotton and try to separate the civilian support from the guerrilla support. And it's just this, I think, really fascinating part of the war that nobody has really studied. Well, let's talk just very briefly about the service in the squadron, because it was miserable. And this is one of my favorite quotes from the book, and it led to the title of the book, where this sailor was talking to an Irish immigrant who was also in the fleet. The sailor was Fayette Clapp. He was a surgeon on one of the boats. And the Irish immigrant is talking about all the problems of serving on the boat. Damn mosquitoes forever bothering and biting us. And he called it the devil's own purgatory. I would add to that with the mosquitoes, they're spreading malaria, especially in the spring. And so a lot of these guys were just feeling terrible when they had malaria because they were just tired all the time. Malaria isn't fatal, but it can run down your immune system, and something else then can kill you. These guys were also drinking the river water, and the river water was contaminated. And so they would get all kinds of intestinal parasites as well. They would get E. coli from drinking this river water, and some men's internal functions were ruined for the rest of their lives. They also, there were cockroaches in these boats, not surprisingly. If you're in Louisiana, you're very familiar with the large cockroaches in the South. And there was one sailor who was writing about how the cockroaches were just on his table, and they would get on his arms and they'd get on his body as he's trying to write this letter to his wife. And at night, the cockroaches would climb on the sailors and they would try to brush them off. These boats were just extraordinarily hot in the summertime. Remember, most of them are metal, so they're absorbing the sun's rays in the day. And sailors talk about if they touch the metal with their hand or their skin, it would burn. It was like walking on a griddle or a skillet. So that what I found out is that not only was there a high turnover rate in 1863 because of low enlistment rate, but I had one of my students study these boats, and this was the 3-month average turnover rate. The lowest was 15%, which is I think pretty high, and the highest was 47%. So every 3 months there was almost a complete turnover on the USS Hastings. So just a shocking amount of turnover, which again led to lower combat ability on these boats because you don't have that consistency. Well, I'm going to wrap it up by talking about why is this important? And I argue a few things in the book. One is that the Mississippi Squadron was an essential partner for victory in the Western theater. Now, historians have kind of talked about this and have recognized it, but haven't really kind of delved into the idea. And I think it's most clearly illustrated with the capture of Vicksburg. So Grant originally tries to capture Vicksburg by marching overland. If you look on the map, that's going to be a supply line. Well, the Confederacy cuts that supply line at Holly Springs. This is in 1862. And so Grant has to go back into Tennessee. He tries a few other things, including these long shot missions into the bayou with the army. None of those work. He also has his soldiers to try, well, it's really formerly enslaved men, to try to dig a canal to reroute the Mississippi River and leave Vicksburg landlocked. That doesn't work, not surprisingly. He realizes he needs the Navy. And what he did was to march his army on the west side of the Mississippi River, south of Vicksburg. At the same time, the Union Navy takes about 10 boats and runs past Vicksburg in April of 1863. Most men thought this was madness. They thought that the fleet was going to get destroyed. But the Union is successful in running past the fleet. Then the fleet meets up with the army south of Vicksburg, brings the army across the river in the largest amphibious operation until D-Day in World War II. And then Grant is now safely on the east side of the river. The squadron blockades the Mississippi River, Vicksburg on the west side, and then you've got this siege, and then Vicksburg surrenders in July of 1863. So Grant doesn't take Vicksburg in 1863 without the Navy in 1864 with about another 50,000 men. Which brings me to another point. Cooperation between the Army and the Navy was necessary for any kind of victory in the West. The Army and the Navy were separate. There was no overall commander. We didn't have a Department of Defense like we do today. I mean, the overall commander was Abraham Lincoln, but there was no overall trained military commander who could kind of negotiate between the Army and the Navy. They were separate. And so the naval commanders could have said, no, we're not really going to cooperate with the Army. To their credit, they cooperated. And so you can see on your screen, Andrew Foote and David D. Porter. They were two of the naval commanders who cooperated with Grant and Sherman. And Porter and Sherman became really good friends. And they had the same view of war. And, Sherman famously was known for his march through Georgia, where he said he's going to make Georgia howl. He said, I'm going to make civilians old and young feel the hard hand of war. Well, Porter wrote almost those same words in 1863 because he wanted Southern civilians along the Mississippi River to be punished and to feel the hard hand of war. He was very aggressive in the way that he wanted to go after Southern civilians. The squadron also facilitated the freedom of thousands of enslaved people. Some of them joined the Navy, like we talked about, but it also it was men, women, and children, men who were too old to serve in the Union Navy. And in some cases, the Union facilitated the movement of these slaves to what were called contraband camps. Today, we might call them refugee camps. And this is a source that I discovered in the National Archives in a log book, a deck log, that lists the slaves specifically who this fleet helped bring to freedom. And it's a listing of nearly 1,000 people. This is just a little bit of it. This is something incredibly unusual because for the most last name in family units with their age, birthplace, and their owner. And the men who enlisted, mainly the former slaves who enlisted in the fleet, provided this crucial jolt of manpower. As I said, in phase 2 and especially in phase 3, you have a lot of slaves who are enlisted or forcibly enlisted into the war. Well, this is the same time that the Union is really expanding the war and expanding the number of boats. And so there's this correlation between boats being built and slaves being enlisted into the fleet. And then that's it. I know it's a lot. I know we went fast, or you fell asleep in 45 minutes, but
No,
I'm happy to take any questions that y'all might have.
yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to ask them. I have a couple questions that popped up there. Early on, you were talking about the Navy logs.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that if compare them to infantry logs, they were much more they were much more detailed and would you consider them more accurate logs, or was there also some artist license that was given to them sometime?
Yeah, for the most part, they're very accurate and very to the fact. And the Navy had to keep these logs because these boats had to know where they were. So, it's based on the Blue Water Navy where the ships are keeping these. Essentially, it's a record of where they go. So they navigate to this place, they navigate to the next place. But then it has also all of this other information about, for instance, Morrison was arrested for drunkenness and put in double irons and confined for 1 day. And then it also lists when they have combat that they expended 17 shells when they're going after those guerrillas, or sailor one on board today, or they do the weather and other things like that. So for the most part, they're very factual as opposed to embellished.
And I guess they would also, you have a one spot, like if you have a cavalry report, things happen that people aren't aware of. But when you're on a boat and there's a defined space,
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard to do that, because I have heard about this, especially the Southern infantry and cavalries being a little bit looser on their interpretations of what happened in a battle and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Let's see what we got right here. Oh, you talk a lot about the northern basically domination of the waterways and the number of boats, and obviously also with a lot of replacement men. But like, what was the Southern government doing to try to combat this, or was their only option basically to build up enforce the forts as much as possible?
Yeah, the Confederacy had a few options, but they're limited. When
Yeah.
you look at industrial capacity, the North had 90% of the industrial capacity in 1860, the South had 10%. The South didn't have the ability to make those plates that went on the gunboats. So the CSS Arkansas it was considered an ironclad, but those plates are actually railroad iron. So if you think about a railroad track, that's what they did. They pounded spikes into this boat, and it's basically just railroad track one after another, which isn't as good as those iron plates, which were more solid and overlapped more. Um, as a the Confederacy could build boats, but they couldn't put the iron onto the boats because they didn't have those facilities, they didn't have those resources. And it was crucial that Missouri and Kentucky did not join the Confederacy because those are places that were boat building. There are a lot of boat yards in those areas, and the Union uses them early in the war. So the Union really gets the head start on this fleet. They also have a guy named James Eads, who is this go-getter who's going to make sure that these boats are finished. And the Union just has more money too. And so for the Confederacy, plus, the Confederacy's on the defensive. And so, it's sort of like gatekeeping. What's the easiest way to gatekeep? Well, you build a fort. And, in one of the forts, they actually tried to they did stretch a chain across the Mississippi River to try to prevent boats from going across it. Again, it didn't work.
And I know this is
There's all
not,
this crazy stuff that came up when I started doing the reading for this book.
and I know this not, this specific question is not your complete area of expertise, but it does. Was there any consideration before secession for the problems that they were going to encounter before the decision was made, or was it just like celebration, we'll figure it out? Yeah, we know the Mississippi River is important, the Gulf of Mexico is important, Atlantic's important, but like, was there anybody like calling like, hey, pump the brakes here, we don't have enough of this or that, we don't have enough iron?
Yeah, there were a few, not many.
Yeah.
Most people were in the South. Well, the South was divided, number one. So people who were diehard secessionists were actually a minority in the South. And then you had people in the middle who were, one or the other. But you had a fair number of unionists in the South as well. Some of them were unionists because, they believed in the sanctity of the Union and opposed secession. But there are other ones who thought, look, we're better off in the Union than we are seceding, because there are laws that force the return of slaves. Whereas if we leave the US, then those laws aren't going to be enforced. And I don't want to be on a battleground. But most of the people who are thinking about secession are politicians. They're not military men. And also, the frame of reference for the most recent war was the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. America wins every battle in that war and wins it very easily. And so if that's your most recent experience with war, you're thinking this is going to be an easy war. And a lot of even generals on both sides, but especially men who enlisted, thought, well, this war is going to last 3 months. And so that's why for the Union, especially, you had 3-month men, they're 90-day men who enlist. But those who were more savvy, a guy like William Tecumseh Sherman, he was saying, no, this is going to be a long and difficult war. A guy like Winfield Scott was the same way for the Union. Even I think Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy realized this is not going to be an easy war.
We had a question about the book. I just put a link. When does it to pre-order it? When does the book actually come out?
Yeah, it can be pre-ordered now. I think the official release date is Veterans Day.
Okay.
So November 11th. So it's about a month away.
All right. The last question was about these. I think you said that some of the boats had sometimes 25% turnover rate on,
or even higher.
And even higher. Okay, that even makes it even more. So when a boat had let's say they had a turnover, let's say it was a guaranteed time that they were going to rotate a bunch of men off, was the boat going to go into were they getting trained at all or anything like that, or were they basically just stuck on the boat?
They were basically stuck on the boat. So I didn't get into it in the lecture, but I write a lot about drunkenness, disobedience of orders, sailors doing bad things, essentially. And part of that is they don't have the training. And some of them are reluctant or they're not very motivated. They're also fighting a war that they didn't expect to fight. These guys were not expecting to be forced to go on land and chase after guerrillas. Sometimes they're going 5 miles inland after guerrillas. And that becomes very dangerous because the tables are going to get turned and you can get ambushed. So these guys, there's a fair amount of desertion in these boats, and they're being shuffled around on the various boats. They're also, building more boats. And so guys who are experienced are being moved off of a boat onto another one to be kind of a core of experienced men. But for the most part, they were on what was called a receiving boat for maybe 4 or 5 days. They get their uniform, they get their hammock. They learn the different whistles. Like one whistle will call you to a watch, one whistle will do this. They learn what the watches were because all sailors had to be on a watch, which meant to be on guard different times of the day. And then they're just put on the boats. So there's almost no formal military training. And, I argue in the book that it was really important for them to be on the gun crews. And that's where they really formed these bonds with one another. And they also formed them in the mess, or we'd call it the cafeteria, because guys would be eating in these same messes together. So it's like their little family on board these boats.
Sounds pretty rough. That's
It
for
was
sure.
rough.
It does not sound like much fun. And,
and during
for either
combat,
side.
I'll just add one thing during combat to add to the rough part is if a cannonball penetrated into a boat, which was common, especially when they're fighting a fort, because those had big cannons, splinters would be thrown all over on the gun deck. And when I say splinter, it's not like the little one that you get in your finger. A splinter could be the size of like a dagger, or it could be 3 feet long with very jagged wood. And so it'd get into your side or get into your hip or your leg. And there's, stories of guys. One writes that, he stayed at his gun crew at his cannon despite the splinter that was very painful. And then the next morning they put him on the mess table and pulled the splinter out of his hip and just kind of sewed him back up, and then he goes into battle. So
Wow.
these guys were badasses.
Well, Robert, I want to congratulate you so much on your book, The Devil's Own Purgatory, the United States Mississippi River Squadron in the Civil War. It comes out in a month. I will put a link in the recording for those who are not listening live, or if you're on live and you want to just purchase it, pre-order it. We got about a month to go. It'll be in there in the link as well. So, and then next week we have Descendants, the Divided Lineage of a Louisiana Creole Family with John Durrell. So, Robert, I want to thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. It's a fascinating history, and we really look forward to it coming out.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it too, and see everybody next week.